Welcome back, everyone. Well, today we're going to dive into a channel that I have never looked at before here. It's called Recollection Road. They've got over 300,000 subscribers, and it's a very unique kind of niche thing that not a lot of channels are doing. They've got a lot of stuff that's just about this is what it was like growing up in the 60s, and this is what it was like growing up in the 70s. And for me, born in 1977, we're going to take a look at if you grew up in the 1980s, you remember this. So I know for a lot of you guys on this channel, about 70% of our audience on this channel is under the age of 35, which means most of you guys watching this will not have remembered the 1980s, or at least most of it. So the 80s for me, kind of thinking back, I'm 2 years old when the 1980s begin, 2.5. And so I'm 12 and a half when they end, right? I turned 13 in 1990. So 1980s is kind of me as a small child, and then elementary school, and then most of middle school, right? And so I started high school in the fall of 1991. So for me, kind of thinking of the 80s, I haven't looked to see what this video is going to talk about, so I'm just kind of guessing ahead of time. For me, the 1980s, in terms of history, since we are a history channel, Mount St. Helens eruption. One of my earliest memories is the Mount St. Helens eruption, which was a big, big deal when it happened. The assassination attempt on President Reagan was a big deal. You have the 84 and 88 presidential elections, which are the two that Ronald Reagan won. 1980 election is when Ronald Reagan defeats Jimmy Carter, who was the incumbent president, but I don't remember that one. Of course, you have the Challenger, which is a huge deal in 1986. And sometime I'll probably do a dedicated video talking about what I remember from that day, because I have a lot of memories from that event. But as far as culture goes, I can remember parachute pants being a thing toward the end of the 1980s, maybe early 1990s. MC Hammer doing Can't Touch This. And some of these might be around 90, I don't know. Obviously, Live Aid with Queen was a big deal. I remember that really well. I remember Hands Across America. I remember We Are the World, which was like this huge music thing that brought a bunch of people together. So I don't know what they're going to talk about, but I'll put the link in the description if you want to check this out or any of their other content. They got a lot of really cool stuff. So if you like this video, you'll probably like a lot of the other stuff as well. Let's go ahead and dive into if you grew up in the 80s, you remember this. Taking a stroll down memory lane here.
If you were a kid in the 1980s, you probably have fond memories of growing up during that time. You often spent afternoons at friends' houses, maybe even jumping on their trampoline or watching MTV.
Yeah, so that was when MTV actually played music videos, and I remember because I grew up. I'm my parents' oldest child, but I was raised by my maternal grandparents, and so my uncle, who was really like my older brother, was 5 years ahead of me in school. So when he was in high school, I was in middle school. And since he was the oldest, he always got up first and got the TV first, and he always had MTV on. Trampoline, we had one when I was a kid, and we didn't have nets around it. You can see there, no net. That was not a thing back then.
You also kept yourself busy by making mixtapes and binge-watching rented movies from Blockbuster.
So I'm going to try not to pause like every 10 seconds on this, but dang. Video on demand, not a thing, right? So our big thing was you went down to Blockbuster, or for us it was Giant Eagle, which is a grocery store, but they had a video rental place attached to it. And you go and you'd pick out a VHS tape, and you had to make sure you rewound it when you returned it. And you hoped that the really popular movie that you wanted to see wasn't out, right? Because it's not like on demand where you can just watch it, right? If everybody had rented all the copies of that video, you just couldn't watch it. You had to find something else. And we would rent games the same way. And mixtapes, definitely a huge thing. You would sit with your cassette in the radio, and you would wait on the radio until the song came on that you wanted, and then you'd hit record so you could record it off the radio. And that was how you got music back then. That was our version of pirating music.
If this sounds like your childhood, then you will definitely relate to these 1980s memories.
The A-Team!
Do you remember being beyond excited to get up on Saturday mornings? The excitement of running to the TV and switching on Saturday morning cartoons
He-Man.
and knowing you didn't have to go to school was a great feeling.
Oh yeah, Saturday morning cartoons were a huge thing. We didn't have all the networks like the Cartoon Network that we have now. You had the local stations, and if you had cable, you had a few other things too. HBO was really popular on cable. It was a paid service. But yeah, He-Man, Flintstones, the Smurfs. Oh my gosh. Oh, the memories.
Some of your favorite shows may have been Thundercats, He-Man, the Care Bears, or maybe even Pee-wee's Playhouse or the Smurfs.
Pee-wee's Playhouse.
You watched all of this while eating a big bowl of your favorite cereal. And in those days, it was all about the sugary cereals.
Yep.
Captain Crunch, Fruity Pebbles, Cocoa Puffs, and Cookie Crisp were just a few.
Yeah, and there weren't nearly the choices that you have today. Mr. T cereal.
Your school days may be best remembered for playing the Oregon Trail.
Ah, yes. You have died of dysentery. And that has made a comeback. But Oregon Trail was such an iconic 1980s game. And you have to remember, computers were not an every home thing like they are now. My first computer was a Commodore 64. And I had these incredible... Oregon Trail was one of the games we had on it. Red Storm Rising, Impossible Mission... gosh, what else did I play that was really popular on there? Raid on Bungling Bay, Airborne Ranger. Oh my goodness.
Where you died from dysentery, lost cattle, and broke plenty of wagon wheels.
What a game.
When it was first introduced, this video game was meant to be educational, teaching kids about the grim realities in the American West during the 1800s. But it became so much more. When the teacher announced that it was time to play the Oregon Trail on the school computers, it felt like a gift from the heavens.
Look at those graphics. Isn't that crazy? Of course, we had Atari as well, which when I was really little, our first game system was, it just had Pong, the ColecoVision. Oh my gosh. The Atari 2600 was iconic. Pitfall was a huge game. Missile Command. Oh my goodness.
During the 80s, every young girl wanted a Cabbage Patch Kid.
Hey, listen, not just girls. I had a Cabbage Patch Kid. His name was Elliot, and they had the signature right on the butt. It said Xavier Roberts on the butt.
The adoptable dolls were hard to come by,
yeah,
especially around Christmas.
Yep.
But once you got one, you were proud to show it off. If you weren't able to get one of those pricey dolls, you may have settled for a strawberry shortcake or a Rainbow Bright. On the other hand, all the boys wanted a He-Man Masters of the Universe figure.
Oh, there's Castle Grayskull. I had a whole collection of He-Man, all the G.I. Joe characters and Transformers. Those were my big three.
In fact, they wanted to own all of the He-Man action figures, along with Castle Grayskull.
Totally had that.
The Rubik's Cube has been confounding kids and adults alike since its invention in 1974.
That was invented in 74. I always thought of that as an 80s thing. I was never really into it. It's made a comeback, though. My 10-year-old, I think his best time right now is about 50 seconds. He is obsessed with it. He's got all kinds of different ones. He's got ones with 2x2, 3x3. He's got like a 5x5. Oh, it's crazy.
But it was in its heyday in the early 1980s. In fact, one of the best-selling books of 1981 was The Simple Solution to Rubik's Cube, written by James Norse.
We did not have YouTube, right? So you couldn't just... YouTube is so huge. Not just because I do YouTube, but like, a couple years ago, I had to replace our garbage disposal at our house. And I didn't know how to do that. So I found a YouTube video showing me how to replace a garbage disposal. Now you can go on YouTube and watch a video about how to solve a Rubik's Cube. Back then you had to get a book. You had to go to the library. You had to get an encyclopedia to look things up. It was such a different time.
If the Rubik's Cube didn't do it for you, then maybe you were one of the lucky ones to get the first Nintendo Entertainment System on your block.
Super Mario Brothers.
This was the era that established classics like Super Mario Brothers, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, and so many more.
And this was actually later in the 80s, right? So the first half of the 80s, the Atari was the big gaming system, the first real popular console that I can remember. And then it was Nintendo, and then eventually you end up with the Sega Genesis and PlayStation. Xbox comes much, much later.
And if you had trouble getting a game to load, all you had to do was blow the dust out of the cartridge.
Totally.
And it
totally
seemed to work every time.
And there was actually a system to how you did that. Like you would hold it and you would kind of blow like you were playing a flute. Like, oh my gosh, so many times did that.
Friday nights were, for many, a Blockbuster night. Stepping into that brightly lit Blockbuster store and seeing an endless selection of movies was a true thrill. It wasn't uncommon to leave with a stack of movies that would last you all weekend.
Yep.
And you could even get some popcorn or candy to go along with it.
100%. Oh my gosh. And you had to, like I said earlier, you have to make sure you rewind, because you had to rewind the tape to the beginning to be able to play it. And so it was kind of a courtesy thing. You would rewind it for the next people that would rent it.
Maybe you were one of the ones that saved up your quarters all week so that you could head over to the arcade to play the newest games and hang out with friends.
I was never a big arcade guy.
You tried your best to make it on the leaderboard whenever you played Pac-Man, Space Invaders, Asteroids, or Donkey Kong. During the 1980s, these dimly lit buildings would be packed with people, plunking quarters into those magical machines for hours on end. Who didn't own a few Garbage Pail Kids during the...
I am not ashamed to admit that I was really into Garbage Pail Kids. It was like kind of a spoof on Cabbage Patch Kids, but they were all like, when you were a kid, right? Look at this stuff. Acne Amy, Prickly Rick, Dirty Harry, Green Jean. These were cool things, and you would buy a pack of them like you bought a pack of baseball cards, which I was also really into. And then you would trade with your friends if you got duplicates. And oh my gosh, oh, this is bringing back memories.
The 1980s. These funny cards became a big hit because they depicted children that looked like Cabbage Patch Kids, but they had creatively rhyming names. From the grossest to the scariest, Garbage Pail Kids were always good for a laugh. But the gum that came inside the packs was some of the hardest, most stale gum you may have ever chewed on.
Not even worth it.
Growing up in the 80s, you may have also been an avid reader. Book series like The Babysitter's Club, Sweet Valley High, or Choose Your Own Adventure were some of the very best the decade had to offer.
I did get into the Choose Your Own Adventure ones. I had Indiana Jones Choose Your Own Adventure, right? So you read, and then when you get to a certain page, it would give you a choice, and you had to, okay, go to this page if you're choosing this, go to this page if you choose this. And a lot of times you'd like die or the adventure would end and you have to go back and do it again. It was such a cool thing. I was really into those.
Judy Blume and Beverly Cleary books became must-reads, and a big incentive for reading all these books was a free pizza from the Pizza Hut Book It campaign.
Back when Pizza Hut pizza was good.
It seemed like every kid growing up in the 1980s was a huge wrestling fan. One of the true forces behind the popularity of the sport was Hulk Hogan. Everyone wanted to be a part of Hulkamania, and the Hulkster had this generation of kids believing that anything was possible through the power of training, prayers, and vitamins.
And then he ended up being in one of the Rocky movies. I think it was Rocky 3 he was in.
If Hogan wasn't your guy, you may have been rooting for the Macho Man Randy Savage and the beautiful Miss Elizabeth.
I couldn't tell you any of the wrestlers today, but I could definitely recognize all the ones from the 80s.
MTV was an important part of the pop culture of this time.
Yep.
During the channel's initial rise and 1980s heyday, it helped to kickstart the careers of stars like Cyndi Lauper, Madonna, and even Michael Jackson.
So yeah, Michael Jackson had Thriller, which was like this iconic music video. Madonna had some really well-known ones, sometimes some controversial ones. Cyndi Lauper, she had actually Captain Lou Albano, who was another wrestler who was in one of hers, I think, in Girls Just Want to Have Fun, maybe. But yeah, I mean, music videos were huge then. People were talking about those. Of course, the idea of kind of like the music video thing goes all the way back to the 50s with guys like the Big Bopper, but it really in the 80s became a big deal.
In those days, they actually played music videos, so you would have to sit through hours and hours of videos until they played the one you wanted.
Yep.
Another pivotal moment came in 1983,
Moonwalk.
when Michael Jackson did the Moonwalk for the first time while singing Billie Jean.
So this was some kind of a Motown anniversary special thing, and you have to remember Michael Jackson was a child pop star, right? He was kind of the most iconic, the most famous member of the Jackson 5. He was really little, but some just incredible moments in like the 60s with him. And so this was kind of really when he, as a solo artist, is really starting to make a name for himself.
And it became his signature move. From that moment on, every kid in the United States decided they wanted to practice that backward glide,
and
which
the
looked
one glove.
deceptively easy when Michael Jackson did it. To look cool in school,
Peg your pants.
Middle and high schoolers across the country began tight-rolling their jeans, growing out their mullet, and teasing their bangs to the sky.
So we called that pegging your pants. At least where I grew up, that's what we called that. But that was a really, really popular thing.
Guy with a can of Aquanet hairspray. These same kids would also spend hours listening to the radio and waiting for the local station to play their favorite song, all while resting one finger on the record button of the cassette player.
It was actually typically two fingers because you would usually have to press record and play at the same time to record. And then you get really mad if the radio person talked over the intro to the song.
There was an art form to crafting the perfect mixtape, as there was only so much time on each side of the cassette. The Sony Walkman made listening to these tapes easy if you were on the go.
And a thing you did was you made mixtapes for your girlfriend or your boyfriend, right? Like I always did this. Like you would make a mixtape of all the songs that really meant something to you and them, and you would make it for them.
Otherwise, they would be a gift for your significant other.
There you go.
The California Raisins were a claymation blues band that not only graced commercials and animated specials, but they also made it to toy stores and the fast food restaurant Hardee's. Not only could you get these collectible figures if you bought a cinnamon raisin biscuit from the drive-thru, but they also put them on lunchboxes, t-shirts, comic books, and posters.
Oh, and lunchboxes. My kids have never really had lunchboxes, but yeah, they were such a big deal back then. I remember the California Raisins. They sang, I heard it through the grapevine.
The 1980s had arguably the
Punky
most
Brewster.
memorable sitcoms of any decade, with shows like Knight Rider, Punky Brewster, The Wonder Years, Alf, and The Cosby Show.
So Alf was about this furry alien that lived with this family. Cosby Show was really, really popular. Obviously, not so much anymore. If it weren't for everything that had gone down with Bill Cosby with his legal issues, let's say, you'd probably see that show all over TV to this day because it was so good. Really good show. But yeah, Punky Brewster. There was another one called... oh my gosh, give me a second. All right, I'm just reading down the list here, some of the popular ones from the 80s. Who's the Boss? Oh my gosh, that was really popular. Growing Pains with Kirk Cameron. Alan Thicke played the dad. Family Ties, which was set here in Ohio, starring Michael J. Fox. That was a big one. Night Court, the original Night Court was probably my favorite show, my favorite sitcom from the 80s. Three's Company. What else did we have from the 80s? The Jeffersons aired in the 70s and 80s. Full House started in the 80s. Some of these were mostly in the 70s or mostly in the 90s, though, so I won't read them. Married with Children started in the 80s, and that was really kind of controversial for a while there. Cheers was in the 80s. Oh, my gosh.
But when it came to movies, there was nothing better than a John Hughes film. If you were a teenager during this time, you were able to relate to all of his flawed characters.
Yep.
Being a lovable loser like Ducky was an achievable goal. Or maybe you too wore your insecurities on your sleeve, like
Breakfast
the girl
Club.
next door, Samantha Baker. Movies like The Breakfast Club,
So you got Molly Ringwald, and there's Emilio Estevez there. Oh, my gosh, classic. Ali
16
Sheedy.
Candles, and Pretty in Pink were so relatable for so many, And
That's
John
16
Hughes was able
candles.
to capture that period of time perfectly.
Iconic. Oh my gosh. Long Duck Dong
The
was one of the
fads
characters in
and
there.
trends that were created during the 1980s are hard to beat. When we see them, we instantly recognize that they were part of a colorful decade that had
And there's a reason why you see a lot of things from the 80s coming back now, because the guys like me that grew up during that time are now the ones making the movies and making the TV shows.
started to make a comeback. These moments in time were, for many, the absolute best
New
time
Kids
to
on
grow
the Block.
up.
Yeah, so by the way, if you are familiar with Band of Brothers, yep, there's Carwood Lipton right there. He was a boy band star, one of the biggest boy bands in history right there.
Let me know in the comments your
Wahlberg.
own memories of the 1980s.
Oh my gosh, that was like a trip down memory lane for me. What did they miss? Those of you who are old enough like me to remember the 80s, what did he miss in that one that you think needs to be added in there? Let me know in the comment section below. And if you see any other videos on that channel, if you go browsing that you think I should check out, let me know that as well. Thanks for watching.